Berlin, además de ser amiga de Moran Cerf, de Dan Ariely y de todos los grandes amigos de las nuevas ideas, a los 5 años ella tuvo la inquietud de preguntarle a su padre, que tenía muy buenos sueños, pero que qué pasaba con esos sueños en la posterioridad, que a dónde se iban, dónde se quedaban. Y su padre le dijo, mira, la verdad no sé. Dijo, bueno, yo ya sé desde los 5 años a lo que me quiero dedicar. Entender algo que probablemente es más complejo que las millones o trillones de estrellas, planetas y galaxias, es el cerebro humano. Heather, además de que ha ganado N número de premios, como el del profesorado del simposio del Instituto de Imágenes de Translaciones Moleculares, es la comunicadora científica número 1 de PBS, de Discovery Channel y de BBC, junto a Neil DeGrasse. Para decirles en pocas palabras su formación, tiene un doctorado por mención de Oxford y una maestría en neurociencias, es doctor en neurociencias, y una maestría en salud pública de la Universidad de Harvard. Sin más preámbulos, a una extraordinaria persona y espectacular maestra, un aplauso a Heather Berlin.
Hello, nice to be here. They're just taking a minute to get my video started. But, so yeah, I was fascinated by the brain from a very early age. And I couldn't understand how this 3-pound piece of matter, with all of its neurons firing, neurochemicals slushing around, could produce our subjective sense of self. And basically it's made up of about 100 billion neurons. Each one has about 1,000 to 10,000 synapses or connections. So it creates, well, it's sort of like an information processing machine. And it encodes for everything we experience, from the moment we wake up from a deep, dreamless sleep until we go back into either a dreamless sleep or until we die. Every feeling, every sensation, every emotion. And it's a myth that we only use 10% of our brain. We actually use all of it. But we're only consciously aware of very little bit of what's happening in our brain. Most of what's happening in the brain is happening unconsciously, outside of awareness. And it motivates our behavior, the decisions that we make. And so I'm really interested in what's the neural basis of these unconscious processes that are really dictating most of our behavior. So we can test this in the lab by giving people stimuli like this. So raise your hands if you can see the subliminal message here. Only a handful of people. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Okay, you can see here in the negative space it says S-E-X, right? And then you have the birds and the bees and the flowers are kind of loving towards each other. Yeah? Now once you see it, you can't unsee it. Something changed in your brain. Right? And that's what we want to track, the neural correlates of your conscious perception, because the physical stimuli stayed exactly the same, right? The photons hitting your retina being processed by your visual cortex remained constant, but what changed was your perception. And that's what we want to track. Now this information, before you were able to see the word sex, your brain was processing it, and it would have affected your behavior in a number of different ways. And there's information bombarding your brain all day, every day. If you had to consciously process all of it, it would be too much. So our brain filters it, yet it still affects our behavior. So this information, for example, here's a copy of Parents magazine that recently came out that I think was sending the wrong message. It takes people a minute, right? Parents magazine, yeah. That went to press. And there's a number of studies that show that this subliminal information can affect your behavior. So here's an example where they show people supraliminally or consciously the neutral boy here. And then subliminally they flash really quickly either the bad boy throwing the cake or the good boy presenting the cake. And all they see is the neutral image, and they're asked to describe the boy. And sure enough, if they had seen the bad boy, they're more likely to describe him with negative traits than if they saw the good boy. And that doesn't just happen in the visual domain. There are studies that show if you're holding, they have a subject going to a lab, either holding a hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee along the way, because the graduate student asked them, can you please hold my coffee? Then they go into the testing room, and then they're given, again, a description of a neutral person, and they're asked to describe how they feel about that person. And sure enough, if they were holding the hot cup of coffee, they're more likely to describe the person as being warm and friendly than if they were holding the cold cup of coffee. So even from all our sensory domains, this information is getting in and affecting our behavior. Here's another message. So raise your hand if you see the subliminal message here. Oh, wow, okay. Wow, so you guys all see the 9 dolphins here in the negative space? That's what you were seeing? What were you seeing? Again, this is a really interesting one because what you perceive is context dependent. So what's interesting here is that prepubescent people automatically see the 9 dolphins. Right? Post-puberty, they see the naked man embracing the naked woman. But again, the physical stimuli is exactly the same. But depending on what you've been exposed to, your brain will perceive things in different ways. It's also important to remember that what you see doesn't necessarily correlate with reality. Our brain is constructing things all the time. It's a controlled hallucination. When we all agree on it, we call it reality. So here, for example, if you look at square A and B, they look as if they're different shades of gray, right? But actually, physically, they're exactly the same shade of gray. This is the shadow illusion. If you remove the shadow and draw a line between them, you can see. And again, the brain is making approximations because A is surrounded by light squares, our brain darkens it up. B is surrounded by dark squares, our brain lightens it up. And I don't know if you guys have this phenomenon here, this dress phenomenon that was like the rage on the internet. So people saw this middle dress, and some people's brain, light was hitting it, so it was ambiguous. Some people's brains darkened it up, made it blue and black, others lightened it up, made it white and gold. So again, what you perceive doesn't necessarily correlate with reality. So we'll use these bistable images in the lab like this one, where, for example, if I prime you with words like elderly and wise, you're more likely to see the old woman looking down. So that's her nose, her mouth, her chin, her eye. Or if I say youthful, vigorous, you might see the young woman looking away. That's her nose, her eyelash, her chin, and her ear. But you won't see them at the same time. They flip back and forth in your mind's eye. Again, the stimuli is remaining constant, but what's changing is your perception, and that's what we want to track, the neural basis of what you're perceiving at any time. And what we know from different studies is that what correlates with what you're perceiving at any given moment are these coalitions of neurons that start firing together. So you can think of it in your brain as like a Darwinian competition between these groups of neurons. Or kind of like a parliamentary election. And occasionally a group of neurons comes to power, they start firing, that's what comes into your conscious perception. It stays there a few seconds. If you attend to something, it stays there longer, until the next coalition of neurons wins, and that's the ebb and flow of your conscious perception. This is actually analogous, this is actually a Twitter feed. But it's like tweets, right? If each tweet is like a neuron firing, if enough people start tweeting about something, it starts to trend in our global consciousness, and that's kind of like what's happening in the brain. It's called fame in the brain. And what brings these neurons together? Well, they're not all firing at the same exact time. That would be like an epileptic seizure. But they're firing in coordination, in sync. And you might think of it like a wave moving through a crowd, right? Each person is a neuron. They're not all standing up and sitting down at the same time, but they're not doing it randomly. In coordination, they're in sync, and that's what brings these neurons together, and they start firing together. The other bit of information is that we know that when you're perceiving something outside of awareness, it activates visually the subcortical visual part, the back of the brain, the visual parts of the brain. So if this is a side view of the brain, this is where your eyes would be. When you're seeing it subliminally, it is activating the visual cortex in the back of the brain. As the information comes more into consciousness, it starts activating the prefrontal cortex, and you get these feedback loops. And that's when the information then comes into perception. So that's one theory of consciousness. There's another recent theory of the neural basis of consciousness called the integrated information theory of consciousness. And this says that basically any system that has integrated differentiated information will have the property of consciousness. So this is a panpsychic view. The brain happens to be one of those systems that has a high degree of integrated information, but it could be in any system that has, and there's a calculation for this number, it's called phi, and that's the amount of consciousness any system will have. That all being said, as I started out saying, much of what's happening in the brain is happening outside of awareness. Right? Freud had this whole theory of subliminal unconscious processes that are affecting our behavior, and we can now start to measure that in the lab. So we can do experiments, for example, like this one, where people are shown money, either a pound, this is done in the UK, or a penny, which is worth less than a pound, and they're asked to just squeeze a grip, and the harder they squeeze, the more of the money they can win. But what happens here is sometimes the pound and the penny are presented superliminally so the person can see it, and sometimes it's presented so quickly they claim not to see anything, but they're still told to squeeze this lever. And what you see is, sure enough, when the pound is presented either superliminally or subliminally, they squeeze harder for the pound, even when they can't see it. And what you see in the brain is that the subcortical parts of the brain, the evolutionarily older part of the brain, something called the basal ganglia, the reward center of the brain, is activated, whether they see the money consciously or unconsciously. Which tells us that we're actually being motivated by things that are happening outside of awareness. And only after the fact does our prefrontal cortex or more conscious parts of the brain become aware. But a lot of our instincts are happening unconsciously. And so you can think of the brain as being two basic systems. You have these areas here in red, the amygdala, the striatum, the subcortical, evolutionarily older parts of the brain, like our reptilian brain. Freud would call it our impulses. They're driving us to immediate pleasure or avoidance of pain. Then you have the more recently evolved parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex here. Humans actually have the largest percentage of prefrontal cortex than the rest of the brain, than any other species. And that is the part of the brain that thinks about the future consequences of your actions. So, your subcortical impulses might say, I want that piece of chocolate cake right now. The prefrontal cortex is kind of like the brake system and says, well, maybe, I want to look good in that bikini in the side, maybe I won't have that piece of chocolate cake. And there's a back and forth between these two systems. And Freud would call the prefrontal cortex like your superego, thinking about the consequences. However, you get a variety of different disorders when there's a dysfunction of this system. So either there's damage to the prefrontal cortex, so the brake system isn't working, or there's underactivation of the brake system, or you have too much overdrive from these subcortical areas, like the accelerator overrides the brake, or if there's a disconnection between these two systems. Any one of these problems can cause people to act out impulsively. And you can see this in a variety of studies. When people even just simply imagine acting aggressively versus imagining a neutral scene, you get deactivation of the prefrontal cortex, lowering of the brake system. And you have the classic case of Phineas Gage, where he had this metal tamping iron go through his prefrontal cortex, and his complete personality changed to he became more impulsive and aggressive. A more modern case of Phineas Gage is a case of this man where he started developing pedophilia-like symptoms in his 40s, which was very rare. And they were actually going to put him in jail, and all of a sudden he had these severe headaches, and they did an MRI, he had a big tumor in his prefrontal cortex. So they removed the tumor, and sure enough, the symptoms went away. However, about a year later, the symptoms came back, and sure enough, the tumor had grown back. So what's interesting about this case is we're going now from simple correlation, when we're looking at what's lighting up when we're doing neuroimaging in the brain, to causation, actually seeing a causal effect. And it brings in a lot of questions about how much responsibility do we have for our behaviors, right? What about free will? Do we have control over our actions? If, let's say, the person has less activation of their prefrontal cortex. Well, according to neuroscience, and this is very broadly speaking, free will is an illusion. The idea that if everything was exactly the same in your environment, everything was exactly the same in your brain, you could have done something otherwise. That would mean there'd have to be something more, like a ghost in the machine. And there's classic studies like Benjamin Libet where he would say, measure brain activation and say, just press a button whenever you feel like pressing it, just whenever you get the desire. And then let me know where on that clock that little ball is the moment you get the intention to press the button, even before you do it, because it takes time to actually press it. And people would do that. And what he found is there was actually a buildup of brain activation about 350 milliseconds before the person actually had the intention, awareness of their intention to move. The brain was already making the decision. And only a little bit after the fact do you become aware of that feeling of volition, like it's me, I, who wants to make this decision. And then they started saying, well, what about free will? Maybe people have the power to control this at the unconscious level. But they did more studies and found that even inhibiting a behavior has unconscious brain activation coming before it. So basically I like to say that the unconscious brain has free will, right? Just not us consciously. Right, and where does that leave us? This means that, well, in terms of personal responsibility, we might have free will, not have free will, but we do have responsibility for our actions because we have the ability, we have the capability to control our behavior. We've evolved that capability. So even though we don't have free will in the classic sort of Cartesian sense, we do have the capacity to have self-control, and we hold people responsible for their actions to the extent that they have the capacity to have self-control. So a child is held less responsible for their actions than a teenager and then an adult because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until about the age of 25. So our brain system isn't fully developed, so children don't have the full capacity to control their impulses. However, there are individual differences in terms of even children in their capacity to have self-control. And this classic marshmallow test shows this, right? So you give a child one marshmallow now, and you watch them leave the room. You say you can wait, and you have 2 marshmallows later, and you see if they're able to do this. Now there's a lot of variation in children in their capacity to do this. And this one test predicts future job success, health, body mass index, all these measures in adulthood, this one simple test in childhood. So you might be thinking, wow, so these kids, they have no self-control, and teenagers are even worse because not only do they have an undeveloped prefrontal cortex, but their subcortical areas are in overdrive, all these hormones and impulses. But what's interesting and why I got into creativity is that it seemed that this prefrontal cortex, although it's good for self-control, it also inhibits it. And when you can release that inhibition of the prefrontal cortex, it allows for creativity, right? It allows for anything goes. You can make novel associations between ideas. And I think also a lot of what we call genius is really creativity. It's putting together diverse ideas and information in ways that nobody else has thought of before, right? I mean, Darwin, all the data was there for all the other scientists, but he's the one who put it together in a way that nobody else had done before to come up with this theory of evolution. So I started getting interested in creativity because I wanted to gain access to these unconscious subcortical processes that were occurring. And I wanted to find when can we get a state in an adult where the prefrontal cortex is turned down. So I started looking at improvisation and creativity. And in particular, freestyle rap, right? This is a really interesting state where a person has to come up with these rhymes in the moment. It needs to make sense. It needs to stay on beat. They don't have enough time to think. They don't have enough time to turn on the prefrontal cortex, which is our filter system. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study with some freestyle rappers, but before I do that, I want to give you a little sample. So I'm going to show you a little clip of someone doing freestyle rap, and then they're also doing a memorized rap. Because in my study, what we did was we looked at rappers doing freestyle rap and compared it to what's happening in their brain when they're doing a memorized piece, and looked at the difference in brain activation between these 2 states. So I'm going to play this video now. Hopefully the sound will work here.
Revision. See, the genes are like a text with 100,000 pages, and revisions occur in the random changes that come from mutations. And when they see the light, that's the performance. That's the phenotype. A natural selection, or that's the feedback side. That's about who survives and whose genes catch rise in the next generation. Yes, what I'm saying is that a rap performance like this is the best illustration for the way that descent with modification works. Because the performance is necessary to change the words, to decide which have an impact and which to send back to the drawing board. In fact, I just did that when you failed to react. Because the body can change, and mutations occur when I improvise on stage. Because up until this moment, everything I said was off the page. But now it's time for me to switch it up and do a little freestyle section. I'm going to try and make it specific so that I can beat your cheater detection. Yes, I might be a bit of a tough act to follow with the Hammersmith Apollo. That's why the angel's next, but I'm a massive apostle of science. Yeah, that's the way that it goes with these craziest flows. This is me just improvising, trying to say what I know. And when I make a mistake, that just does me rocking the rhythm and trying to introduce a little bit of mutation into the system. I might just come with these freestyle ciphering flows. Simon the Saint found some nice stuff in my rhymes with the Bible code. He's been analyzing them on the this. I'm not a geneticist, but I kind of understand the things that they've been expressing, like every human being on this planet is relative, which means every relationship is relatively incestuous, which this couple demonstrates. Nice one, excellent. This is the way that I'm rocking the rhythm. This is what you call agnosticism, rationalism. But man, all of these critics have been pissing off Rob and it's talking about, ooh, godless liberals. Oh, come on, there's more to godless liberals than that. We got quantum physics and we got ideas about evolutionary altruism. Okay, and some people might try to say that, wait, humanism is the new religion. But it's not, because our ideas are open to revision. See, that's the difference right here. I'm trying to speak this stuff clear. And if you like that idea, then you can make some noise back at me. I'm just trying to scream it out with a lot of audacity. Get science does figure things out. Actually, not just mysticism. I'm trying to flip it to this rhythm. Yes, this is me introducing more randomness into the system. But this is my little concept. It's kind of simplistic. It goes like this: performance, feedback, revision. So if you want to know about evolution, this is the definition. Like this: performance, feedback, revision. And if you want to check it out again, I got CDs so you can get them. Like this: performance, feedback, revision. So anybody here can use this concept to learn how to do anything if you want. Performance, feedback, revision. So say it with me: performance, feedback, revision. Thank you.
Wow.
So I hope the translator was able to catch all that. Maybe happy you got that out. But I just wanted to demonstrate, it's really in the moment. You have to run, it has to make sense. You don't have enough time to kind of bring on this sort of conscious part of your brain and really think about it. It's almost like what Freud would call free association. So that rapper was Baba Brinkman, and full disclosure, he's also my husband. So I got
Wow.
So I got access to his brain, really easily. And I put him in my fMRI machine, which looks at blood flow to the brain in real time. And when he first got in, some of my lab assistants noticed two rather disturbing holes right here in his socks. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know what that was about. I was like, oh, he was trying to impress me. We were just dating at the time. But anyway, so he went in there and he did rap in the scanner. He did freestyle and memorized rap, although you had to stay very still because you can't move your brain in the scanner. These are some pictures of his brain. As you can see here, this part was actually missing there. And that's the part of the brain that has to do with listening, which is completely a joke. If you're married, you get that joke. He had a very nice, large, healthy prefrontal cortex, which I like. So this is based on some preliminary data of rappers who did this in a scanner. What they found is that when they're doing freestyle compared to memorize, there's a unique pattern of brain activation. You get actually decreased activation here in these areas in blue, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain here. And that's the part of the brain that has to do with filtering your behavior to make sure it conforms with social norms. It also has to do with your sense of self, self-awareness, sort of your inner critic. So, when you're in those freestyle states, you have to turn that part of your brain down. And that's why a lot of artists say they lose their sense of self. It feels like it's coming from someplace else. They lose their sense of agency. And the filter is turned down, so again, anything goes. Novel associations between ideas. And you get this kind of flow state. And what's also interesting is that a similar study in jazz improvisers, where they were doing a jazz piece improvised on a piano versus memorized, and found the same exact pattern of activation. You get decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You also get increased activation here, and you find it here as well in the medial prefrontal cortex. And that has to do with the internal generation of ideas. So internal generation of ideas is turned up, the filter system and the sense of self is turned down, and you enter this free-flowing state. It's associated with very positive emotions. The moment you become too self-aware, right, you're too self-conscious, you break the flow state. And it messes up your performance, right? And you find that with anything. At first, let's say even in sports, with playing tennis, you have to consciously pay attention and learning how to hit the ball exactly. You're using your prefrontal cortex. So once it becomes, you become better at it, it becomes implicit, it becomes automatic. You start activating these unconscious processes. And then, at that point, if you think too hard about it, how exactly should I hit the ball? It will mess up your performance, your flow state. So I want to sort of find how we can access these creative creative states, how we can access these brain states to help people achieve greater flow and creativity. But what's also interesting is not just during creativity that you find this pattern of brain activation where you lose your sense of time and self and place, you become fully absorbed in what you're doing. You also see it during certain types of meditation, during daydreaming, during certain types of hypnosis, and during REM sleep. So when you're dreaming, your prefrontal cortex is turned down, the subcortical areas are turned up, and so a lot of the dreams don't make sense, right? They don't have to be rational. And these are similar patterns of brain activation as we see during creativity. You lose your sense of focus. Again, it's associated with very positive emotions. People strive to get to these states. And my question is, can we find a neural signature of improvisation and creativity across different art forms? So let's say when somebody is painting, or doing theater improv, or comedy improv, or dance improv, will the brain look the same across these different art forms? And if so, how can we help people achieve those states more easily and stay there longer, and perhaps it can be therapeutic? So the final thing I want to kind of talk about is just bringing us forward into the future, is that as our understanding of the brain increases, it will allow us to influence it in more direct ways. So I'm going to give you a little taste about what's currently achievable with brain-computer interfaces and ways that we're kind of learning to change ourselves and who we are with a push of a button. And that perhaps by integrating technology into our brain, which is starting to happen already, we might be able to increase our capacity for our intelligence, our creativity, and change who we are as people. So right now, these neuroprosthetics we're using actually to treat illness, right? We're treating psychiatric illness, something called deep brain stimulation. We implant these electrodes into these subcortical parts of the brain that I've been talking about. It's connected to a wire that's implanted under the skin in a battery pack that's implanted here in the chest wall. And we can actually stimulate with remote control specific circuits in people's brain. Now, this sounds like it's pretty sci-fi, but it's been being used for treating people with movement disorders for years now. Now we're moving into the realm of psychiatric illness. This is what the electrode looks like. It's about 1.3 millimeters. It has 4 different contact points, so we can play around with the different contact points and see which works better in different people. This is what it looks like when it's implanted. It's minimally invasive surgery. The patient is awake during surgery. We can talk to them. They just, drill 2 little burr holes right in the brain and just put the wire in. It's pretty straightforward. But this deep brain stimulation is used when nothing else has worked. So these are people who are very severe, let's say with depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, where they've tried every medication, every therapy. They've tried electric shock therapy. Electric shock therapy is kind of like if your computer is not working, you kind of just turn it off and on again, and it reboots and something happens and it works. You don't know exactly what. But with deep brain stimulation, it's like very specific. It's almost like if you shut down a specific app in your computer or your phone and turn it back on again. And this, I'm going to show you an example of a patient with implants for treatment for Parkinson's disease. Because as I said, it started with being used for people with movement disorders. So you're going to see him shaking with Parkinson's, and then you'll see what happens as soon as they turn on the stimulators. So I'm going to play that now.
Okay, so we're here for the initial programming session. You got both sides of the brain put in, bilateral stimulators, and we're here for the initial programming session. This is what it looks like without the medicine and the stimulator. And now we're just going to turn it on. If I can get my fat fingers to hit the button, there we go. See how it feels. Wow. How you feel? Yeah. Excellent. Try tapping both your fingers for me. Wow. Excellent. All right. Feels pretty good? Okay, good.
It's pretty amazing. So this technology is now being developed and being implanted in different parts of the brain, depending on which disease it's aimed to treat. So it's now in use for obsessive compulsive disorder, Parkinson's, a variety of movement disorders. It's in development for things like depression, epilepsy, and so forth. And so it's really exciting technology. We've done some clinical trials with obsessive compulsive disorder. This is what it looks like implanted. And it's important to remember that for these severe cases, we actually used to go in and lesion parts of the brain. That means kind of damage them, and then it's irreversible. And if it doesn't work, now you have brain damage. But the thing about deep brain stimulation is that it's reversible, it's adjustable, it doesn't damage the brain. So it's a really good alternative to treat these what we call intractable or untreatable psychiatric illnesses. And what I'm going to show you is another little clip of a patient in the operating room, right? She has, so we test out the stimulators in the operating room just to make sure they're implanted in the right way. So you'll have people who have had depression for years, and then all of a sudden you turn on these electrodes, and this is what happens.
Describe what you're feeling right now.
I feel happy. And that's, again, pretty amazing that we can actually go in. Again, we're going away from correlation to actually direct causation. We can go in and affect how people feel and change their behavior. So by stimulating the brain directly and sort of changing their emotions. So you have to be nice to neuroscientists because we have our finger on the button. And now we're moving into, so those are electrodes that are stimulating the brain. But we're moving into these brain-computer interfaces where you have these microelectrodes that we can implant in the brain that actually record information from the brain, okay? So then it records information, so you can imagine this. If I say to you, just don't move your right arm, but imagine you're moving your right arm. Now we implant this microarray that records the information in your motor cortex, that what it looks like in your brain when you're thinking about moving your right arm. Then that translates to a computer, and then that computer translates that information to a robotic arm. So now there are people who are paralyzed, who can now think about moving their arm, and that information with this implants can move a robotic arm for them. Pretty amazing. And now, more recently, there's studies that just came out of UCLA, Caltech actually, where they can now give feedback information, sensory information from a prosthetic arm, so a patient can actually feel things from that arm. Again, really amazing. There are people who are quadriplegic who can't communicate, who can now, with these implants, think about moving a cursor on a screen, and they can actually type out a message with their thoughts in these different states. Elon Musk has recently revealed that he's starting a new brain-computer interface company called Neuralink, where it's going to be these, and this is just not what it actually looks like, it's a sort of simulation, where it's going to be this mesh that they implant in your brain that kind of forms with your brain. And again, we're going to start syncing up this technology with our brains so that it's going to be not only used to treat illness, but ultimately it's going to be used for cognitive enhancement, right? So these implants are kind of the Model T forward of what's to come. And as our understanding of how the brain works increases, so will our ability not only to treat disorders, but also to design cognitive enhancements, or these brain-computer interfaces that can potentially improve our processing speed of our brain, our memory capacity, our attention span, our intelligence, and our creativity. But of course, there's ethical considerations, right? So again, who can afford to have these implants, right? Will it be like performance-enhancing drugs, where certain people have an advantage so that nobody can get them? And what if people can hack into your neural implants? So these are some questions that academics are asking now, but are likely going to be a reality for, let's say, my children. And also it's going to bring into question identity, right? What does it mean to be human? And there's this thought experiment where if you take one neuron and replace it with a silicon chip, would you still be you? Would you still feel pain? Yes, probably. What about another neuron and another and another? And at what point, as we sort of become cyborgs, are we ourselves, and what does it really mean to be human? And as you think about also AI technology that's increasing, is that going to replace us? Are we going to merge? And these are all questions that we really do need to start asking because the technology is developing. It's going to keep developing because it's helping people with disorders, but ultimately it's going to move into these realms. And fundamentally, what we really need, I think, is an overarching theory of consciousness. Because we're going to have to really start thinking about, as we create AI systems, do they have consciousness, right? Can they feel pain? Because that really matters to me. Because, for example, your refrigerator, you can kick it now, nobody cares. But if it could feel pain, it would matter if you kick it, right? So we need an overarching theory of consciousness to know, for example, does a bee have it? Does a fetus have it? Do these AI systems have it? Does the internet have it? Because these will, again, be important questions in terms of how we treat these systems. And again, as we start to merge with the technology as well, and what does it mean to be human? So, the more I learn about the brain, and this has been a lifelong project for me, and it will continue to be, because I think it's one of the most fascinating pieces, if not the most fascinating piece of matter in the universe, right? Carl Sagan said it's the way for the universe to kind of know itself, for matter to know itself. It organized itself in such a way, and in the talk before, we see the vastness of the universe and how much is out there. And our Earth is that little speck of dust, and our brains are minuscule, yet the matter is organized in such a way that it can comprehend its place in the universe. And to me, that's really extraordinary. And I don't know, some say we don't even have the capacity, our brains are limited to know themselves, right? We might never really fully understand how it works. But what can we do with the knowledge that we have so far? Well, I think that one thing that's really important as I work with patients as well is to try to bring these unconscious processes that are happening in our brain to the surface, to try to better understand our own motivations, our desires, our drives, and our fears, so that we can perhaps live more in line with our future goals. And that's a lot of what psychotherapy does, is try to bring these unconscious processes to the surface, to understand ourselves better, and achieve things that we want to achieve and be happy. And ultimately, they say know thyself. But I think that this ultimately leads to what we might call wisdom, which is having experience, which takes time, emotions, knowledge of facts, and good judgment or common sense. And I often get asked again about these AI systems, artificial intelligence. Well, they are certainly more intelligent than us in many ways. But the question is, do they have emotions, right? Do they feel things? Do they have common sense or good judgment? And maybe that's where, humans, that might be our last little bastion, or maybe creativity. But who knows? Maybe these AI systems will take that over too, and we will evolve away. Hopefully not. But so the question still remains, how does subjective experience arise out of matter? And hopefully, maybe in my lifetime or my children's lifetime, we may be able to come to this answer, which people have been asking since, Descartes, many hundreds of years ago. And I will just leave it at that.
Wow.
Muchas gracias, Heather. ¿Tenemos preguntas? Acá.
Do you think it is desirable to have a civilization where the brains of all people were manipulated so that all people were good people, were pathetic people, and not having that free will illusion you talk about?
Okay, I have a hard time. I have a hard time understanding that question.
How about manipulating the brain in a way that all people were good people?
That old people are
Became
old people.
all people become good people.
Yes.
Yes. How
All the
do
way
you
to
make
Brooklyn.
all people become good people? Oh, I wish. It depends on what you mean by good, right? So, we've evolved. Humans are complex. Behavior is complex, and And the problem is, so we're getting to the point where we can maybe, I think, more at the genetic level. So we're looking at which genes code for brain development. I think once the brain is fully developed, it's hard to go in, because human behavior is so complex. There's not like one circuit that codes for bad behavior and then you can just knock that out. It's much more complicated than that. But I think if we look at things like psychopathy or psychopaths, we're starting to understand that a little bit better. And if we can go down to the genome and understand the genes that code for psychopathy, I think with things like CRISPR and genetic modification, perhaps we can go in at that level and start to change things. But because human behavior is so complex and it's not as simplistic as one specific circuit, it would be very hard to do something like that. And with everything you take away, you know, there's always an unforeseen consequence, right? So if you made everybody altruistic, that might not be the best for all of society, because, you know, there are some people who are cheaters or evolve for certain reasons, or some people who are risk takers are important, and we need those people to take the risk. So I think it's just very complex, and there's no one definition of what it really good means.
Thank you. Are you ready to receive a chip yourself? Your brain. Are you ready to receive a chip in your brain?
That's a good question. Well, somebody asked, you know, I think that I'm really interested in time perception because, you know, our one most limited resource is on time, right? Our time is limited. So if I could have I'm really concerned with this. I really don't want to die. Like I have pretty much a fear of dying. I don't want to lose consciousness. But if I can insert an electrode that can manipulate my sense of time, so that even though we're in these small moments, I'll perceive them as lasting forever in a way that might give me a sense of immortality. So if there's a chip for that, I get it.
Wow.
I have a question. This doesn't work. I have a question here. How much of the emotions is innate? I mean, you were born with it. And how much is learned? Like you see your mom, how she reacts to being sad or being happy, and you learn from it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Temperament you have very early on. So you can actually, there's studies that show what the baby, the way they're crying or if they're fussy or not, translates to how their whole personality will develop in life. So we are born with certain predispositions towards, let's say, different personality traits. We're born with an innate ability to feel things, to have just pure sensation, right? When I talk about consciousness, I just mean, you don't need language for it, you don't need words, you don't need anything, just feeling pain. And I think we were born with that capacity. You don't learn really to feel pain. It just happens, you feel it. And I think it's the same thing with emotions. But then when you get into psychiatric illness, a lot of that, there's a genetic predisposition, and then usually a stressor will bring out so we call it the psychiatric break or something. So if you're prone towards depression, but some people have it very early on. So I don't think that psychiatric illness or emotional disorders are learned. I do think that there is a strong genetic component interacting with the environment. But the simple capacity to feel emotion, that is, we are born with that. It's just how the brain operates. Yeah.
Vamos a la pregunta que nos pida, por favor.
La pregunta, bueno, sí, la pregunta es para los que...
Oh, wait, let me put this in, so I know what you're saying. Hold on. Okay.
La pregunta es para los que nos dedicamos en alguna forma a la creatividad. ¿Cuál sería tu consejo para bajar esta barrera que existe y ser más creativos, encontrar esas conexiones que no existen, sin tener que ponernos un chip en el cerebro?
Yes, you don't need to implant a chip to become more creative. So this is my advice for that. It's about letting go. So if you're saying you're trying to work on a novel or something, or think of something, okay, I'm going to take a step back. Consciousness has a limited capacity for how much variables it can keep in mind at any given time. The unconscious has an unlimited capacity. We haven't found the limit yet. So a lot of times we take in information consciously, and then when you don't think about it, it's called deliberation without attention. It allows the unconscious to work on it in a much more complex way, right? It can manipulate many variables. And then when people all of a sudden have these moments of flashes of insight. It's when the unconscious has been working on the information without you having to think about it, and then it suddenly comes into consciousness. And with creativity, it's similar. Your unconscious is working on a lot of these things all the time. Let's say you're working on even if it's solving a math proof, or writing a book, or doing some painting. It works on it, and allowing that information to not think. You have to allow yourself to not think, which means go for a walk, just daydream. Turn off that prefrontal cortex, which is like, I gotta think about it, I gotta be creative now. The more you try to be creative, the less creative you'll be. So it's kind of counterintuitive, is to let go and let the unconscious kind of filter its way through the surface, and that's where I think most of the creativity comes from. When you get into those flow states, it's when you lose your sense of self. So it's about letting go. Go for a walk. That's my best advice.
Les pido si pueden formarse aquí quienes más quieran hacer preguntas. Una y una.
Hola.
Oh, so my question. Which one? Is there any research on sexual dysfunction and also on psychopathy?
Oh, you already answered that, but I'm not very sure. Okay. So sexual dysfunction and psychopathy? Yeah, so basically people who are psychopaths, or now it's technically called antisocial personality disorder, and also depends on the type of sexual dysfunction, but if you need kind of basically lack of impulse control. It's the same thing with antisocial personality disorder. You get decreased activation, specifically in a part of the prefrontal cortex called the orbital prefrontal cortex. And so people go for that immediate pleasure despite the consequences. But there are different types of psychopathy. There are some people who actually have overactivation of the prefrontal cortex as well, and they're very manipulative. They sort of lack empathy. So there's the type of people that are just going for immediate impulses, and they sort of go and murder someone impulsively because they don't think about the consequences, and they're sociopaths. But there are other people who are very controlled, but they lack empathy, so they'll do anything for personal gain in a very methodical way. And it also involves the prefrontal cortex, but in one case it's underactivated, and in the other it's sort of increased activation and lack of emotional areas that are active, like the amygdala. It's similar with certain types of lack of impulse with sexuality as well.
Les pido por favor que sean breves sus preguntas. Respuesta. Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Mi pregunta es, tú hablabas al principio acerca de la comprensión del contexto para poder interpretar la información que estamos percibiendo, matizarla con emoción, etc. Mi pregunta es, ¿están haciendo algo al respecto para tratar personas con síndrome de Asperger en cuestiones de estimulación a través de electrodos o algo así?
Yeah. So things like Asperger's and also autism are very difficult to treat. So these kind of implants are only really good for disorders where we know where the circuit, where the damage is. So the thing that's the rate limiting step is understanding the actual circuits involved with the disorders. Now things like Asperger's and autism involve, the brain is sort of connected up differently across the board. So there's no one place that we can go in and intervene. So most of those things are going to be behavioral modifications. We can't really do it at the neural level because there's so much going on. It's the same thing with schizophrenia. Like schizophrenia involves so many different neurochemicals, different neurocircuits in the brain. There's not one place that's like this where we can go in and intervene. So again, it's only going to be appropriate to certain disorders. But with those kinds of disorders, like Asperger's and autism, is that we are understanding more about the genetic aspects to it, and I think those are some of the disorders that are going to be more amenable to genetic modification rather than the neural implants.
Thank you very much.
So I feel like we are facing like new sociocultural tendencies, such as the delay of marriage or like the delay of motherhood. So I don't know if there's some kind of like scientific explanation on the brain related to that sociocultural movements.
For the what? Say it.
Like the delay of marriage or the delay of motherhood, or maybe like the
like why people delay marriage or delay motherhood?
Yeah, I don't know if there's some scientific explanation about that. But I think it's generational.
Yeah, I think that's more of an evolutionary biology question. So there's some studies that show that people tend to have children earlier on when they're in a more where resources are more scarce, and there's more uncertainty about their future survival, then you tend to actually find that people have children at younger ages. When you live in a more secure society, where you're safe and you're going to have access to food and water and things like that, people actually tend to hold off having children because they don't feel that evolutionary pressure that it needs to be done right now because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So I think there are more evolutionary explanations. There are some neurobiology things, and they have to do with neurochemistry and things like oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical that is released during orgasm. It's also released during childbirth and during breastfeeding that bonds people together. And some people have more of it, some people have less of it, and that relates to how much you want to kind of, I think, more to the marriage question as well. But if you hug someone, this is great work by Paul Zak, if you hug someone for 10 seconds, it releases oxytocin and it brings you a bond closer together. So hugging is good for everyone. Yeah. Is there enough time for you?
Perdón, we will have a problem because of the time. I will ask you to do like 3 questions and that you answer briefly and 3 questions there. But I want to let you know, les quiero decir a todos, de que todos los speakers van a estar todo el día con nosotros. Solo también un break de 1 hora. Allí van a estar y van a poder acercarse a hacerles preguntas. Entonces, you will have the opportunity and the chance to talk with the speakers in this occasion. It's different than ideas, they will be all around. También decirles que después de 3 preguntas muy rápidas, 3 allí, para que ya se sienten los demás, lo siento, pero van a poder platicar con ellos. Van a haber donas, afuera hay unas donas de Rosetta y los quiero incentivar a que pregunten rápido. Las donas de Rosetta son para comérselas. Okay, so 3 questions very quickly and 3 answers very quickly. 3 together, vas. Dispara.
Is the idea that free will is an illusion a scientific consensus, or is there still hope for free will?
Tu pregunta.
Free will.
Good morning, thank you for your lecture. I would like to know what is the role who plays dopamine oxidation in the development of diseases such as Parkinson and Alzheimer, and is it possible to take any antioxidant therapy in order to prevent
the role of what did you say?
Of dopamine oxidation in the development of Parkinson of diseases such as Parkinson or Alzheimer, and is it possible to take any antioxidant therapy in order to prevent?
Similar to the first question, what does the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics say about determinism and free will?
Okay, good. So I can roll this into one. Okay, those 3. Okay. So free will. So the Cartesian definition again is everything is the same, exactly the same. Every neuron is firing exactly the same way. You could have chosen otherwise. And according to neuroscience and that, it's pretty much we all are on the same page with that. There's something called compatibilism. So that doesn't. So there's one. If determinism were true, it would mean that since the Big Bang, everything, the way that we're acting is all predetermined. And I don't sort of go along those lines, but there are people who are compatibilists. So even though you don't have free will, there's still some randomness. I'm sort of trying to combine these two, and it's hard. But the thing about quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle, a lot of people ask about that. Just because there's uncertainty at the quantum level doesn't mean that it scales up to whether a neuron fires or not. And the brain also is an environment where it's sort of the temperature is in such a way that those properties that are happening at the quantum level. So for example, if it scaled up to the macro level, then you might suddenly just disappear and reappear over there, right? That doesn't happen. So just because you can't conflate the two, if there's uncertainty there, that it's uncertainty whether a neuron's going to fire or not. So theoretically, if I knew everything about your brain, how it was wired, and every experience you had, and every neurochemical in your brain, I could predict whether you're going to go left or right. And when we do neuroimaging, we can look at, we say go left or right, and up to 10 seconds before you're even consciously aware of which way you're going to go, we can decode the brain activation and predict with great certainty if you're going to go one way or the other. So I think the concept of free will is an illusion. However, studies show that if you tell people they don't have free will, they're more likely to act unethically and cheat things. So it evolved, the illusion evolved for a behavioral purpose.
Wow. Preguntas ahí muy rápido.
Oh, I forgot this question. I'll do it in a minute. The oxidation. Okay.
Neuroscience do for memory loss?
Memory loss. Okay.
Just regarding these images of brain activity, how reliable are them
as far as to detect exactly which group of cells are active, and so how comparable are they between people, between different subjects? That's my question.
Okay.
Hi, well, my question is, what is the relation between consciousness and emotions or feelings?
And emotion?
Emotions.
Okay. I feel like this is like an IQ test for me. I gotta okay. So, memory. There are ways to increase memory behaviorally. There are a lot of things you can use mnemonics and use kind of outside props to kind of prop up your memory. However, there's new studies now that actually with the implants, you can help improve memory. I think that we're going to get closer and closer to. So we're not going to be able to, let's say, maybe cure Alzheimer's anytime soon. Hopefully we will eventually, but we're closer to actually being able to increase memory capacity by implanting these electrodes in parts of the brain like the hippocampus that are involved in memory. Emotion versus consciousness. So consciousness basically is anything that you feel. So emotions are one of those things that you can feel, but so is experiencing the color red or hearing a sound. So it's pure subjective experience. An emotion or thought is just one of those many things that can come into consciousness at any given time, if that makes sense. And then, let's see, the last one was the dopamine. I'm not sure about the antioxidants. I don't really know that much about it, but I mean, dopamine is obviously involved in things like Parkinson's. And what's interesting about that is the treatment is that you give them more dopamine, but if you actually, too much dopamine can make you have hallucinations, like illusions. So sometimes on these anti-Parkinson's medications, they start having that, you have to decrease the medication. So, and then also with schizophrenics, when you treat them to decrease the dopamine, they might start having some Parkinsonian symptoms. So it's interesting the balance of these neurochemicals in the brain. And if they're off by just a little, you can get problems. I think that's it.
Señoras y señores, un aplauso a Heather, por favor.